So as we said, we're only going to talk about how to shoot for planar tracking. But that doesn't mean that 2D tracking is wrong, just that planar tracking is usually better. We have a lot to cover, so we'll go a bit fast because we're assuming you'll just refer to it right before a shoot. One of the main paradigm shifts is that you no longer have to put in tracking markers, because planar tracking doesn't track points. It tracks texture. We can track anything that has some kind of pattern to it. But we can't track things with absolutely no pattern, and those times we have to help out. In this chapter, it's important to distinguish between a tracking problem and a compositing problem, because almost everything is an easy track. So it's really the composite you have to think about when you're shooting. There are two ways to composite, either to replace what's there with something completely new, or to combine the new element with the plate and to keep the original reflections or texture. Starting with a straight replace, a typical example would be a license plate, which is as simple as tracking it, then we can paint a new license plate in Photoshop, and then insert it back, completely replacing the original license plate. Unless there's foreground passing through the shot, this is extremely easy. If we're replacing something that isn't rectangular, like a logo, it helps to have some clean pictures of the entire surface. So after the shot, it's good to get the surface from a clean angle, because then we can make a clean background in Photoshop, put in the new logo, and then track the whole thing back in. This way, the background keeps its natural texture. If we just dropped in a graphic, it would replace the entire surface and wouldn't look real. The element we're tracking is allowed to leave the frame, as we saw in the last chapter. So all the problems with 2D tracking are really gone, and it's important not to shoot with that in mind, because you'll just make things worse if you start putting in markers. The element is also allowed to be partially blocked. The planar tracker really doesn't need to see a lot of the plane to track it, so we're fine to have an actor walk in front. We're also using planar tracking to pull a mat of the actor, so these kinds of shots sometimes make themselves. But there is a danger here, because as we've said many times, you can't count on matting through complicated foreground. All it takes is one actor with frizzy hair to make this a nearly impossible composite. We're actually not doing too good in our shot either. If you compare it to what she looked like before. All the fine hair detail is gone. So we strongly recommend that if you have the chance, that you make any element keyable by painting it green or blue. Then it doesn't matter if anyone steps in front. We'll get a perfect mat every time. Another huge plus to making elements green is that we'll have a much easier time finding the element's own outline. This prop, for example, wouldn't just need tracking to insert an image. It would need major roto work to find the edge. But a green element finds its own edge. So these are two really good reasons to use green elements as much as possible. But there is a downside to green elements, that they have zero texture, which can be a tracking problem. It's not a problem when you can see the whole thing, like in the cloud shot, because then the shape of the element is a texture in itself. We can even track something else on the same plane. So here we're tracking the gravel in the upper left, but the insert is over on the green cloud. As long as they're on the same plane, we can use one to track the other. The problem is that if the surroundings have no texture, like this green poster on a wall, or are not on the same plane, like this green element out in the open, or we push into or pull out from the element completely so there's no clue where we are, there's just no way to track it. And in those situations, we do have to put in tracking markers. Then we pull out. And then this is the easiest track in the world. Without the markers, it would have been one of the hardest. The same goes for all shots that have no built-in texture. If we wanted to place a note on the refrigerator, this track would fall apart right about here. And we'd actually have a real problem. So again, we can place some tape squares. But really, anything will do. Then here's the note. And then it's super easy to track it in. Since the markers fit nicely behind the note, they didn't have to be painted out. The second kind of compositing is to combine the new element into the shot instead of just all out replacing it. To keep the glare or any natural texture, which always looks better. Especially monitors that are near the camera should always be tracked in post because it's hard to make them look really good live. There are two choices for backing color, either black, and then you double expose or screen the graphic on top and the glare stays. Or green or blue, and then you key it in. Contrary to popular belief, modern keyers have absolutely no problem keying through reflections. And we'll talk about this much more on the green screen volumes. The clear advantage to green is that we can see exactly what we're tracking. And anything that steps in front will get an automatic matte. So you should use green or blue when you can. The downside is that as soon as you have green elements, the cinematography has to be about that. And you can't adjust the exposure on the green element without changing everything else, which can be a deal breaker for green. This one would probably work. But other times the green will come out murky and unkeyable. And in those cases, you're better off just putting something black behind the glass and screening the graphics on top. But then also be aware that anything that moves in front has to be rotoed by hand. Now, great as these reflections are, there's a constant danger of tracking the reflections instead of the surface. The extreme is a mirror. But if you ever have reflections that could overpower the surface itself, or even worse, a surface that's only reflections. You have to put in tracking markers. 4 or 5 distinct squares is enough to define some texture. Unfortunately, the markers will also end up in the composite, so they have to be painted out. But this lets us track it. Actually, we can also creatively rearrange the stuff on the table to get it on the same plane, and track those things instead. Again, as long as they're on the same plane, they tell the computer just as much about how the insert should be moving. So now we've done the same thing without markers. But don't panic about reflections, because everyday reflections aren't overpowering and we were perfectly able to track the phone. Just be careful if they're stronger than that. Now, there's an important thing to know about planar tracking, that new elements will be placed on the plane we're tracking. For the outside of a window, that means that the entire skyline will move as if it's a poster hanging 4 feet outside the window, which is very unrealistic. To use planar tracking for this, there's only one solution, which is to put the green screen as far back as possible and make it huge. But that's not really necessary. Later we'll talk about a more advanced kind of tracking called match moving that lets us work in real 3D, and that's the better way to do it. Until then, there's also an old 2D trick to placing outsides of windows, which is to track a marker in regular 2D, and then simply pin the skyline to it. In the real world, a skyline has basically zero parallax change, so we only need to match pan tilt and camera wobble, which we can do by tracking a single point, or 2 if there's any rotation. So the rule of thumb is always place 2 tracking markers on a green screen outside a window. Place them on what will be the horizon in the final shot, then it tracks better. It's also worth noting that if there's no camera movement besides pan tilt, then planar tracking is total overkill, because all we have to do is track a single point near the insert, pin the new element to it, and then we can pan and tilt as much as we want. Finally, it's important to realize that planar tracking tracks flat planes, and that means that you can't track anything round or curvy. This needs to be tracked as a virtual prop, which is pretty high-tech, but we're not ready to talk about how that works yet. You also can't track things that change shape, like a flag or a t-shirt, and there's no simple way to do that with any technology. Changing the logo on this t-shirt would be incredibly difficult, unless it was pretty flat.